Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Zeal or No Zeal. Today, up on the chopping block is Pato Box, published by Bromeo. The game is a fighting and adventure game. The combat in this game is like Punch-Out, but it also features some light exploration. Does the game excite? Find out in this episode of Zeal or No Zeal. As I booted up the game for the first time, I was thrust into a difficult boxing match, which I inevitably lost. This served as the tutorial, but also set the scene for the story. It was cool to see this introduction fit seamlessly into the premise of the game, and as I spent more time with the title, I came to realize that Pato Box actually does have an intriguing story. I was not expecting this initially, but I actually ended up appreciating the zaniness that the writing brought. As I explored the world, I encountered different documents detailing the world and the characters within it. They were not overly significant, but they were a welcome addition to the game. These passages were also fun because they often had implications in the gameplay. Before boss fights, some passages would give hints on the different patterns for an upcoming fight. It helped prepare me for these fights, but the fights never felt spoiled, as there were plenty of moves that were not shown on the pages. Additionally, sometimes these documents would give me hints about secret collectibles in the overworld. This made reading these passages even more interesting. I liked their writing, and I also liked seeing what kind of different secrets were hidden in the documents I got to read. However, while the story was interesting, Pato Box truly shines in its gameplay. The game features both a boxing component and an exploration mode. The boxing was interesting. I had to learn different patterns, react with good timing, and stay alive to the best of my ability. It was fun, and it was enhanced because the controls were quite precise. The game monitored my input closely, and if I pushed a button but got interrupted, it would continue to go through with the action potentially minutes after the action had taken place. Though this sounded frustrating, I ended up liking it a lot. It ensured that each action I took was calculated and intentional. This was further enhanced because each attack was telegraphed clearly. When I got hit, it was my fault, and thus the additional punishment for my errors felt perfectly justified. Additionally, I even had chances to redeem myself. Just before dying, the screen would zoom in, as though I were on my last breath. If I survived that last hit mode for enough time, I would restore a good bit of health, and have a chance to continue on once more. This mechanic also helped me stay engaged with the game, as I never felt like any run was entirely a lost cause. While the fighting patterns were largely engaging and fun, many of the fights featured segments where it was impossible to damage the boss. Whether I needed to curate a delicious soup or evade robe sashes, these segments were often disappointing. It was not that they were unfair, but after failing a couple of times, it feels frustrating to play through an easy but required segment that is occasionally avoided. Since my opponents often pick their moves at random, if one of these lengthy and vulnerable segments came up at the beginning of a fight, I would sometimes reset the fight and deal some damage first. It was not a glaring issue, but I do think it slightly hindered my experience, especially since many of these segments were not as challenging as those where I needed to attack. Even though there were some disappointing aspects of the fighting combat, the positive far outweighed them. It was a lot of fun to learn how to take out the different bosses, and I felt adequately rewarded for doing so. Unfortunately, the open world exploration is far less riveting. I often had to navigate tedious areas that didn't feel rewarding. Some of them had simple puzzles, while others were literal death traps. Regardless, they didn't really move me. There were a bunch of fetch quests and simple tasks that just did not resonate with me. None of the adventure mode techniques developed over time, and thus they were so surface level that they were not rewarding. To be entirely honest, these segments just slowed down the pacing of the game. There were a couple of cool moments, but my adventure was certainly lacking. On another note, there is an arcade mode that skips this unnecessary filler. This makes it easy to revisit boss fights and makes it possible to play the game without these minigames. Overall though, I still did have fun playing through Pato Box. The fighting mechanics are interesting, fun, and kept me hooked throughout. However, it was filled with a lot of meaningless exploration and unsatisfying minigames. It made the package much less exciting than it would have been without the overworld. Plus, to make things worse, some of the overworld areas lagged and dropped frames. I'm not an expert on that sort of thing, but it was definitely noticeable to the naked eye. Thus, though it's disappointing to say so, I do not have zeal for Pato Box. It has a very intriguing story, and a great foundation with its combat, but the game also has a bit of an identity crisis with random overworld segments that dilute the core gameplay and make it far more forgettable than it should be. I'm wholeheartedly glad that I played the game, and it certainly has charm, but it's not an easy game to recommend. Thank you so much for watching.